How does karma really work? Bruce Charlton, Rudolf Steiner, and his living disciple Terry Boardman have expressed many useful insights based on a version of the concept of karma. For instance, that many of the bad things that have happened, and are currently happening, in relation to the West, are due to karmic consequences of our civilizational untruthfulness and materialism. But I don't believe that karma is a good way of expressing this, because karma is itself an abstract and systematized representation of an alien cultural concept, when in truth we live in a personal universe, a reality consisting of beings who are alive, conscious, purposive, and in relationships with each other. The reason karma can be useful is insofar as it is a summary description of the purpose and meaning of beings, but karma is mistaken and misleading insofar as people think of it like something from physics, as an objective fact like a force field or pattern. At a first level of analysis, it may be helpful to envisage the current sorothic evil trend of global and within national politics and society as a manifestation of karma. By sorothic I mean the sadistic and spitefully motivated destructive policies of the leadership class who are actively creating war, violence, famine and mass disease, and the deliberate and rationalized implementation of these policies by a servile and value-inverted managerial class of bureaucrats, intellectuals, propagandists, and punishers. When we consider what will happen to these sorothic-dominated beings themselves, it seems inevitable that, repentance aside, they will destroy themselves. And in the most horrible fashion. And this inevitability could be termed karmic. But karmic is often used as if what was at work was an impersonal pattern of justice built into reality, whereby people, and demons, get what they deserve because that is part of the structure of the universe. Instead, I believe we ought to think of it as evil feeding upon itself, as the working through of chosen assumptions onto the perceptions and conceptions of individual beings. It is therefore a personal matter of purposes and motivations, not of abstract patterns or structures. When a being chooses to gratify his sins, chooses to align with that in himself and among other beings which is opposed and hostile to God and divine creation, then such a mindset has downstream results. After a person has chosen to believe that his own fear and resentment-fueled spiteful sadism is a valid and desirable life philosophy, then this becomes his bottom-line reality. It becomes how life is and should be for him, so that he ceases to want anything else, and repulses any alternative worldviews, such as the Christian. If that is how life is and should be for any being, then of course all sorts of consequences follow, including his own self-chosen destruction. Even when this suicidal motivation is concealed by a veneer of false justification that explains how it is that setting up a situation for his own inevitable destruction is actually rational self-interest. Surely a Christian can perceive this all around the world, and on our own doorsteps. Spiteful fantasies of the suffering of enemies are usually projections. Bruce Charlton. Something that is very evident in the mainstream leftist mass media, the alternative right blogosphere, and among traditional Christians, is a tendency publicly to engage in, and advocate, fantasies of the suffering and destruction of their enemies. I don't expect better from leftists and the secular right, but I do expect better from Christians, in the sense that this kind of stuff is revealing of the individual embracing a fearful, resentful and spite-driven nature. Fear, resentment and spite are all sins, and all besetting, characteristic, sins of our time and place, which is why this revenge fantasy stuff is so common, and so generally tolerated. Tolerated and indeed excused, on the basis that, from whatever point of view, the subjects of spiteful fantasies of suffering deserve it. Which may or may not be correct, but is irrelevant, because the sin lies in the, apparently, unrepented, because publicly celebrated, indulgence of one's own fear/resentment/spitefulness. Of course, many of us, me included, for sure, are prone to this kind of sin. We are variously assailed by gnawing fear, brooding resentment, and fantasies of what horrible things we would enjoy happening to our enemies. And if we don't suffer from these sins, then there will be others, just as much sins, and just as prevalent and tolerated approved. Such as dishonesty, and despair. After all, we are all sinners, as Jesus told us, and that's an intractable fact of this mortal life. What matters is whether we acknowledge and repent the sins, when we begin to become aware of them. And public propaganda, and celebration of our own sins is the opposite, it is doubling down on sin. Note, doubling down on sin in public usually makes that sin even more difficult to repent. It seems to be a common psychological trait that when we have made public commitments to sin, then, the sin of pride deters us from publicly acknowledging, or even in private acknowledging, to ourselves and God, that we have made a mistake. This is why the demonic overlords have arranged society such that we are bribed and coerced into multiple public celebrations of value inversion. But, no power on earth can prevent the repentance of a man who wants to repent and instead choose affiliation to God and divine creation. Note added, the problem of spiteful revenge fantasies is particularly acute and increasing, because the top-down engineered descent of the world into destructive chaos provides almost daily temptations. Christians need to remind ourselves that my enemy's enemy is not, thereby, my friend, and that overall spiritual good comes only from good motivations, and not as a byproduct of evil intent. The weakening power of ritual means that rituals can nowadays reliably induce evil, but not good. Bruce Charlton. In the past, say high medieval times, the performance of a ritual had an objective effect, that is, the participation in a ritual powerfully, and uniformly, made the participants think alike, be motivated alike, etc. Participants would conform to ritual. The external passed into the internal. Nowadays human consciousness has changed, such that the power of ritual has weakened greatly, or even ceased to operate, and ritual no longer works in an objective, almost irresistible, manner. What matters most now, at least in a positive sense, see below, is the internal, and the external is secondary. Thus, an outward ritual may help, or may hinder, an intended internal state, but the ritual does not compel the mind, in the strong way it used to. One implication is that, because of the greater ease of destruction than creation, ritual continues to be pretty effective in a destructive way, but not in a positive, Christian way. So, while church rituals are feeble in effect, the rituals of leftism, for example the training in feminism, anti-racism, diversity etc., which employees are compelled to participate in, do have some reliable negative, and destructive effect on the participants. This, simply because it is much easier to encourage sin than virtue, even rather feeble external stimuli, images, songs, slogans, can objectively encourage sin. Likewise the coerced rituals of the Birdemic succeeded in creating the sin of fear at a mass level, but it would not be possible to use these same propaganda and manipulation methods to encourage people, that is, propaganda cannot, anymore, fill people with courage, or other virtues. Hat tip. A comment by Scarpheadine. The West in 2024 is not like a city under siege, it's much worse than that. Bruce Charlton. Back in 2011, I published a pessimistic little book about political correctness, i.e. mainstream totalitarian leftism, called Thought Prison, and at one point I compared the nations of the West to a city under siege in which the rulers of the city loathed the ordinary people, and therefore always took the side of the invaders. These rulers covertly aimed at the destruction of the city, opened the doors to the besiegers, gave them privileged status in the city, and confiscated shelter, food and clothing from the natives of the city to support the invaders. But, in 2011, I was way too optimistic. Our situation in 2024 is much worse than the besieged city analogy, because I assumed in 2011 that the natives of the city would, at least, notice and understand what was going on. But they don't see, and they don't get it. The ordinary citizens of 2024 don't even recognize that their rulers, all the rulers, all who actually or even potentially have power, despise and hate them, and want them dead and gone. This failure of recognition is because the citizens hate and despise themselves, and for good reason, since their value system is short-termist and merely hedonic, the ethics of the barnyard, peace, convenience, comfort, entertainment. An ideal for animals, not for men. And it is a fact of history that such a materialistic value system never has, and never shall, inspire men to courage and coherent action. This was recognized by George Orwell in 1941, comparing the sensible, materialistic H.G. Wells with Adolf Hitler.
What has Wells to set against the screaming little defective in Berlin? The usual rigmarole about a world state, plus the Sankey Declaration, which is an attempted definition of fundamental human rights, of anti-totalitarian tendency. What is the use of pointing out that a world state is desirable? What matters is that not one of the 5 great military powers would think of submitting to such a thing. All sensible men for decades past have been substantially in agreement with what Mr. Wells says, but the sensible men have no power and, in too many cases, no disposition to sacrifice themselves. Hitler is a criminal lunatic, and Hitler has an army of millions of men, aeroplanes in thousands, tanks in tens of thousands. For his sake a great nation has been willing to overwork itself for 6 years and then to fight for 2 years more, whereas for the common sense, essentially hedonistic worldview which Mr. Wells puts forward, hardly a human creature is willing to shed a pint of blood. Similarly, why are the Russians fighting like tigers against the German invasion? In part, perhaps, for some half-remembered ideal of utopian socialism, but chiefly in defense of Holy Russia, the sacred soil of the fatherland, etc., etc., which Stalin has revived in an only slightly altered form. The energy that actually shapes the world springs from emotions, racial pride, leader worship, religious belief, love of war, which liberal intellectuals mechanically write off as anachronisms, and which they have usually destroyed so completely in themselves as to have lost all power of action.
Our situation now is even worse than 1941, much worse, since the West has been gutted even of the emotions, so that the masses are utterly demotivated. Self-destructive, because blind and ignorant, toddler tantrums don't work as a motivation, not when the system is structured against you. Meanwhile, the globalist totalitarian leadership class, the modern H.G. Wellses and their multi-billionaire sugar daddies, have lost all residual positive desire or pretense genuinely to create peace, convenience, comfort, prosperity. And instead glory in the sadism of engineered destruction, while deceiving the masses, and their own loyal middle management class of intellectual workers, with a fantasy, fake, virtual world of sound bites, pseudo-narratives, media-fueled distractions, and moralized chaos. Your enemy's enemy is not your friend, unless he is your friend anyway, and already. Bruce Charlton. We really are very lucky, in an ultimate and spiritual sense, because it is getting easier and easier to navigate the realm of public discourse. When truth and lies were fairly evenly mixed in the output of officialdom and the media, then in order to get the benefits of truth, we had a tough job to discern it from the dross. But nowadays public discourse is very nearly pure untruthfulness, that is, the stuff we reel in all mainstream sources, and most pseudo-alternative sources, too, is a mixture of outright lies and stark truth inversions, with multiple shades of distortions, hype and other forms of manipulative misleading. And that's all it is. A realm of anti-truth, in other words, as is inevitable when the motivation behind it is anti-good, because anti-God, anti-divine creation. Therefore, by far the main current danger is not that we will miss out on some valuable truth in the public arena, but instead that we will be tricked into believing stuff that ain't so. The main way that people are tricked into helping their enemies, is by mainstream persons or institutions being reported as saying someone thing usually, that is true or good, and by presenting somebody as your friend simply because he is the enemy of something you also oppose. But your enemy's enemy, whether real or pretend, is not thereby your friend. An alliance is qualitatively different from shared opposition, especially when, as now, multiple issues are involved, yet these issues are all linked spiritually into two parties, the party of God, and the party against God. When there is one way we ally with God, but an endless number of ways in which we might oppose God. The idea of making an ally of your enemy's enemy is an old delusion, that often backfires, personally and at large scale. For instance, when the UK made a de facto ally of the USSR, which I regard as the most evil regime in the history of the world, in order to fight Germany and Italy, this immediately damaged Britain. For example, we sent them war material and food that we could not spare without significant cost. And then, after a couple of years, by strengthening, at the US's as well as UK's expense, the USSR far beyond what it required to defend itself. So this alliance also proved very costly indeed in the longer run, as the USSR went on to overrun vast territories beyond its former western boundaries. A further factor was encouraging and protecting espionage, Soviet spies, which inflicted serious costs post-World War II. But then, the USSR-British alliance was never what it seemed on the surface, not really the pragmatic or war-winning strategy it was presented as being. Because the British ruling class was, as Orwell often described, broadly permeated with many communists and crypto-communists, i.e. those whose primary loyalty was to the USSR, and who were willing, and indeed keen, to sacrifice British interests and the British people, to those of the USSR. What applies globally applies in smaller scales. It is tempting in the short term, and maybe all but irresistible, to make common cause with your enemy's enemy, but this should be encapsulated as temporary and for specific purposes, and should not be allowed to become an alliance at the psychological level. It is particularly easy to delude people just at present with manufactured and controlled enemy's enemy figures, pseudo-allies, and would-be saviors. Insofar as people in the West are becoming aware of the corner into which they have been painted, of the multi-pointed lethal situation that has been constructed around them, then they become desperate for some way out, some escape from the terrible material consequences that are looming. People rarely consider that the material disasters are a consequence of spiritual corruption, and they move directly to seeking some rapid material solution to whatever is currently the most imminent material problem: war, violence, immigration, economic destruction, disease. They want to change the world for the better, without in any way changing themselves for the better. But where on earth could such a motivation for genuine betterment come from, when the people themselves are so corrupt as to have made the problem in the first place? They are then very easily tempted to embrace some already powerful individual or institution who is presented, by the mainstream sources often presented in an apparently hostile way, yet given wide coverage nonetheless, also to be seeking a solution to one or other imminent problem that is real and which concerns us. The invitation is for us to join with them as an ally, to make them the focus of our hope and efforts, maybe to serve them in what way we can. But there are no such people, no such institutions in the mainstream sources, nobody with power, high status, or wealth, who is truly on our side as an ally, nobody who deserves to be the repository of our hope. If any such person did exist, then we certainly would not hear about them in any mainstream source, nor by any of the semi-mainstream pseudo-alternative media. More profoundly, that whole way of thinking is harmful to our souls. I mean that it is spiritually harmful when we of the West strive to place hope in any external and worldly power, when we seek to find someone or some group to obey and to serve. The fact is that it is now, and by a large margin of decades, too late to prevent the collapse of Western civilization, because Western civilization is now, and by a large margin, not worth saving. At the depths of Western man's soul he knows this, and has developed an ideology of abstract altruism that disguises his own nihilistic despair, his own self-hatred, spiritual and physical cowardice, and rationalized suicidality. If we are not merely to strengthen our enemies overall and in the long term, the way out must be spiritual before it is material, and must be personal before it is societal. And anything else is a demonic snare playing upon our natural fears and desperation at the situation which we colluded, whether actively or passively, in making. The Continuing Sorrows of Albion. William Wildblood. I mentioned in a comment on Bruce Charlton's blog that what has been happening in England recently is that the Saxons are rebelling against their Norman rulers. That's true enough, but it's also an oversimplification in that similar things are happening all over the Western world as the native populations show they have had enough of being ignored and replaced in their own countries by aliens who will not integrate with integrating, meaning that the newcomers adopt the customs and ways of the indigenous people rather than requiring them to accept the newcomers' customs and ways. You might say that the hard realities of blood and soil are coming up against the ivory tower abstract theorizing of elites cushioned by wealth and power. These elites, because they are intellectually captivated by abstractions rather than recognizing the concrete realities of such things as God, country, home and family, adopt the moral high ground, seeing themselves as the defenders of peace and harmony, totally failing to understand that they have created a situation in which peace and harmony are increasingly difficult. Trotting out lazy accusations of racism and far-right terrorism merely demonstrates the utter failure of the establishment, the politicians, the media, the universities, to admit their own responsibility and recognize how they have ignored and overridden the wishes of the native populace for many years in order to foist their own ideological agenda on an unwilling country. Yes, you might say that, in which case you could think that the establishment at least had relatively good intentions, even if these were also naive and foolish. But there is another approach you could take, and that is to see the whole stratagem as deliberate. No doubt, the middle-ranking sections of the establishment pursued the historically disastrous policies of mass immigration and multiculturalism because they thought it was on message and or personally advantageous, but there would have been those who knew perfectly well what the consequences would be when a tipping point had been reached. They wanted to undermine national identity and damage communal trust and thereby create a situation in which sorrowfic destruction would occur. For the goal is destruction of the West as it has been and the replacement of our nation-states with a globalist tyranny, and if you doubt this, ask yourselves why it is only the Western nations that are required to absorb vast numbers of unassimilable and culturally alien foreigners. That having been said, one must recognize that, though there is certainly a criminal element among some groups, these migrants mostly just follow ordinary human nature in that they are seeking a better life, and are more comfortable with their traditional cultures. As are most people except the deracinated Western elites. But the current wave of immigrants have no real loyalty to or love for Great Britain, so to put them on parity with the native British just because they have been given a passport is absurd. Nonetheless, they are still for the most part pawns being used by a section of the elites to bring about a certain desired end. It is these elites who should be condemned, not the pawns. Ultimately, all this is a battle in the spiritual war. What is taking place is inevitable in these end times, which doesn't mean there is nothing you can do about it, but moral, national and societal decline are all hallmarks of the Kali Yuga in which we find ourselves. We have to use this to direct our attention to the salvation of the soul, and part of that means we do not allow ourselves to be consumed by anger or hatred. That's the mistake of the rioting Saxons, who forgot the old adage that two wrongs do not make a right. Their violent reaction, besides being quite wrong in itself, has merely given the elites grounds for self-justification and done their cause considerably more harm than good. Those of us who can see the spiritual picture have to be wiser and take a longer view. All that matters is the state of your soul. That is the only thing you can really control. However, we do know that the good, the real spiritual good, will win in the end. Remember how in The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis, a very prescient story, Narnia was destroyed, but the incorruptible beauty of the real Narnia, the one on which the earthly Narnia was patterned, remained in the higher worlds. That is true of all that we love in this world too. Truth is not objective, ordinary reality. Francis Berger. The following is commentary on an excerpt from Badiaf's Truth and Revelation. My thoughts in italics font.
Truth is not objective, ordinary reality, reflected in the knower and entering into him from outside, but rather the enlightenment, the transfiguration of reality. It is the introduction into the world's data of a quality, which was not there before truth was revealed and known.
Christians tend to regard truth as an objective, ordinary reality that enters from the outside. I can't count the many ways Christians have informed me of this, using all sorts of evidence to support their point. You want reality? Try flying off a building by flapping your arms. Better yet, let me punch you in the face. Feel the pain? Good. That's reality. That's all fine until you notice that this approach to reality differs little from the sort that pure materialists like Auguste Comte promulgated. At best, partial truth is the only thing an objective reality approach reveals, a reality stripped of spirit, hence, not reality at all. Reality runs deeper than people reacting to external stimuli. Reality seeks spiritual participation. Reality is what happens after the aggressive Christian punches me in the face, and the pain subsides. Reality is how I decide to think about the punch and what I do about it afterward. During those moments, I can step beyond the objectiveness of reality and transfigure it through my subjective being and freedom. I can inject a quality that was not there before. See or reveal a reality that was not there before the truth of the punch in the face was known. Reality goes beyond what and asks why.
Truth is not conformity with what we call being, but the kindling of a light within being.
Aligning with God and creation is not a lifelong conformity project. If it were, then God would be the same as the totalitarian demons destroying the world. Aligning with God and creation is not about complying with God's plan via submissive obedience. Instead, it is the realization that God's plan depends on our plan. The two plans must meet and align. We are not just seeking the light of God, God is also seeking the light in us.
I am in darkness and seek the light. I do not yet know truth, but I seek it.
Those who are in darkness are slaves, but those who are seeking light in the darkness are utilizing their freedom. The act of seeking is a preeminent indicator of spiritual freedom.
By this very fact, I affirm the existence of truth and light, existence in another sense than the existence of the world's realities. My seeking is already the dawning light, and the truth is already beginning to reveal itself.
Objective reality truth is an oppressive, mundane imposition that demands unthinking subservience. Those who seek beyond that level of truth begin to understand that truth is an awakening of the spirit leading to the communion of spirit. Objective truth is knowledge of reality. Spiritual truth is reality itself. Objective truth is lower truth. They mean well. What it really means. Bruce Charlton. They mean well is a phrase used frequently about the astroturf activists who support good, i.e. leftist, causes such as anti-racism, climate, anti-war etc., but go too far by committing acts of sabotage, menace, destruction, violence etc. The term is also applied to the totalitarian manipulated intractably stupid masses, who get their facts and opinions from officialdom and the mass media. They mean well. So far as I can discern, they mean well actually means 1. I want to feel good about myself. Plus 2. What makes me feel good about myself is approval from those who get their facts and opinions from officialdom and the mass media. This is understandable, as most types of sin are understandable, for example dishonesty, resentment, greed, lust, laziness, being based in instinct. But I don't think that really means that such people mean well, even when they constitute a large majority of the Western population. Reacting to system manipulation is not genuine action. Francis Berger. We need to do something. We need to act. A common urge among Christians when confronted by the system and its evils. Nothing inherently wrong with the urge if it leads to genuine spiritual action. Potentially fatal when it inspires only reaction. The system is calibrated to trigger negative spiritual participation, primarily through lies, deceit, and manipulations that aim to provoke reaction. Reacting to system manipulations may look and feel like positive spiritual action, but it is anything but. The actual act remains within the system domain, the reaction is primarily a Pavlovian response. Reaction assures the system of the effectiveness of its conditioning and manipulations. The more we react, the more assured the system becomes. Jesus instructed us to turn the other cheek. Modern man interprets this as pacifism. A terrible error. Turning the other cheek signifies the transcendence and transfiguration of a reactive state. The person striking you on the cheek expects a reaction. He anticipates your striking back. He does not anticipate the turned cheek. His model of reality shifts. He finds himself in an undiscovered country, suddenly uncertain about what may come next. Christians talk a lot about transfiguring themselves and reality, however, they cannot transfigure anything in a reactive state. Why? Because reaction is not genuine action. Reaction is not doing. Reaction is having things done to you. Reaction defies transformation because it keeps you locked in the faux reality of determinism. The only thing reaction confirms is how impossible it is for you to have made any other decision or performed any other action. The system loves that sort of thing. The urge to do something must motivate Christians to act, genuinely act, rather than merely react. The root of such motivation is in thinking. Dealing with the problem of entropy. Love versus bliss, creation versus stasis. Bruce Charlton. Mainstream Christianity, although, presumably, not what Jesus actually said and did, has apparently always embodied a fundamental, metaphysical, incoherence, whereby it has tried to assert two incompatible worldviews and life aspirations. I assume, but cannot prove, that this arose as a consequence of early theologians being unwilling to give up their Judaic assumptions and or the classically derived Greek and Roman philosophy, especially Neoplatonism, and instead fitting the simple reality of Christianity into one, the other, or both of these pre-existing molds, thereby creating the unclarity, paradoxes and mysteries which have existed since. Entropy, leading to our death and the death of every person and thing that we know, is an unavoidable experience and fact of life, unavoidable so long as we are aware, purposive, and or take memory seriously. People have therefore dealt with entropy, tried to remove it from experience and or from reality, by several tactics and strategies. One is the goal of living in a perpetual present. If time is cut down to a present moment in which, so far as we can tell, nothing happens, then we have apparently deleted time. If there is no time, there is no entropy, and no death. The idea in practice may become manifested as life being cut up into a sequence of disconnected nows, each without relation to what went before. To some extent, this can be seen in popular mainstream culture, and its extreme uninterest in looking at trends, or joining the dots between facts or experiences. That was then, this is now. So I bother about it. Concern about the past or future is a downer. If I feel okay now, then that's all that matters. In effect, if I can say I see no entropy now, i.e. there is no change, no degeneration, no death, in the time slice that is the present moment under consideration, then, it is inferred, entropy can be denied or ignored. This works insofar as analysis is restricted to this present moment. Ultimately, this aspires to delete time, or, if not possible, to delete any perception of time. Thus life aspires to a state of stasis, preferably blissful stasis. The aim is contemplative, not creative. Thus the ideal state is to stop or escape time, and therefore, necessarily, to stop creation, more exactly, to stop creating. God's creation is seen from this perspective as done and finished, completed once and for always, total and complete, a creation to which nothing can be added. The above analysis and purpose seems to be converged upon by a wide range of religions and spiritualities, I think because it arises from commonly shared assumptions and practices, from a particular way of dealing with, of escaping from, the problem of entropy. The attitude aimed at is indifference, detachment, not feeling, not caring. The desire is to become unaware of entropy and its consequence. The attitude aimed at is acceptance, don't compare, don't remember, don't plan. Accept whatever happens. Maybe it is all regarded as good. But however regarded what is, just is, and should be accepted. Our misery is interpreted as a consequence of failing to accept. But, by my understanding, what Jesus said was aimed at those of us who choose creation as our primary goal, not contemplation. Those of us who choose love as our fundamental value, rather than indifference. Jesus dealt with entropy by accepting its inevitability in this mortal life, and offering the elimination of entropy, life everlasting, in resurrected heavenly life, after death. The need for resurrection derives from the inevitability of entropy in this mortal world. From the fact that this mortal world cannot be redeemed. Entropy is a part of this mortal reality, therefore there cannot be a heaven in this life or on this earth, which is why the heaven of Jesus is in the resurrected life and in heaven. Jesus' teaching is linear, sequential, includes time, includes change, entails freedom and the capacity for love, and from this it promises to eliminate death, which concept included sin and corruption. In the heaven made possible by Jesus, there will be love, creation, and change, but there will not be sin, corruption or death. Resurrection is a voluntary remaking. We desire and allow ourselves to be remade without entropy, and without sin by following Jesus, and that is the only way it can happen. Implicitly, Jesus dealt with entropy by love, and love is a choice, love entails freedom. Jesus embraced creation rather than contemplation, and invited men to join with the work of creation, to become sons of God. This is why heaven is necessarily opt-in, because people cannot be made to love, nor to create, these come from freedom, not coercion. And this is why those who do not, from their freedom, opt in, are thereby, self-excluded. And those self-identified Christians who aspire to a heaven that is without time, that contemplative not creative, is changeless, is experienced as a constant present. Well, such people are wanting something different from what Jesus actually offered. Question: why can't Western nations mind their own business? Answer: because they have no business to mind. Bruce Charlton. Sensible and commonsensical people from places like the USA, UK and France will often wail, but why can't we just mind our own business? Meaning, why are we intervening/interfering abroad, when so much needs to be done to sort out our affairs at home? This, especially, when it comes to engaging in wars on behalf of nations with which we have no treaties, or intervening to replace the rulers and change the way of life of anywhere we fancy, anywhere in the world, for as long or as short a period as is convenient to us. But the simple answer is that we cannot mind our own business because we have no business to mind. For instance, what, exactly, is the business of the UK? I don't mean to ask what our business should be, but what our business actually and currently is. To which we can only say, there isn't anything at all, no actual business. Not so far as the people who run the UK, and their obedient managerial state minions are concerned. At least, there is no positive business. The fact is that our rulers, for example in politics, finance, megacore, and the mass media, are already sorting our affairs at home in just the way that they want it sorted. That is, they are replacing the native population with immigrants and encouraging hatred between them. They are destroying the economy and the environment, and have already captured and corrupted the military/legal system/policing/education/health services/churches. Their home business of civilizational and social destruction is going very well, therefore they are minding their own business, i.e. the business of destruction, so, from their perspective, they are free to engage in similarly destructive foreign adventures to their heart's content. Are all religions fundamentally the same? Bruce Charlton. When you get something false, because it is false, asserted as often as that all religions are fundamentally the same, it is usually because of an unexamined, perhaps unnoticed, assumption. Disagreement arises among those who do not share this assumption, yet the root of the disagreement is too seldom unearthed in the heat of argument. I think that people started saying all religions were, at root, the same when people started focusing, almost exclusively, on this worldly aspects of religion and began ignoring, or simply not thinking about, what happens to us after death. In essence, the disagreement over whether religions are the same hinges around whether we assume a religion is defined by what it says and does about this mortal human life on earth, or whether we assume a religion is rooted in what it says about the life of our soul/spirit after we have died. For atheists, and therefore the mainstream of public discourse in the modern world, of course, death is the end, so it is unsurprising that their comparisons of religions focus entirely on the psychology and social behavior of various kinds of religious people. Since there are many broad similarities in the behavior of people of various religions, then, by these assumptions, it seems reasonable to assert that all religions are fundamentally the same, and that differences are superficial and contingent. The other group who assert religions are fundamentally the same are those Westerners who advocate the perennial philosophy, some oneness spirituality that draws upon mystical, often Eastern, religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism or the like, and upon the tradition of Neoplatonism or Gnosticism, for example, either with a pagan or Christian vocabulary. Such people do believe in existence beyond death, but this existence is impersonal. Survival is without ego, without personality, perhaps pure passive contemplation, perhaps by assimilation into the One, from which all originated. Oneness spirituality regards this mortal life as secondary, temporary, superficial, indeed an illusion, Maya. The only real reality is in the permanence and changeless stillness of oneness. Therefore, from the perennialist/oneness perspective, all specific religions are this worldly, ego-focused, and delusional, therefore all religions are fundamentally the same, i.e. wrong. But if instead we assume, as I personally do, that the fundamental nature of a religion is defined by its account of what happens after this mortal life, that is after death, then we get a very different understanding. If the main thing about a religion is supposed to relate to this mortal life and world, then we may well conclude that the similarities are more important than the differences, and that all religions are, near enough, the same. But if instead we focus on the nature of life after death, as I believe that we should, then we discover that there are many, qualitatively distinct and mutually incompatible differences between religions, and differences between any religion, and other types of worldview and ideology. For instance, if we expect or desire to reincarnate after death, there are several very different models of how reincarnation works: recycling of souls, spiritual evolution, operations of karma, etc. If one of these reincarnations happens to our soul, then the others don't happen. And therefore the religions are different. Likewise with other possible outcomes. If, like the ancient Greeks or Hebrews, every soul is assumed to become a demented ghost, dwelling forever in an underworld, then this post-death outcome is absolutely distinct from and incompatible with the Christian belief in resurrection of the body to eternal heavenly life. In sum, all religions can be regarded as very broadly the same if we focus wholly on our bodies, on human psychology and sociology, during this mortal life on earth, but there are many distinct religions, and non-religions, if, instead, we define a religion primarily by its assertions concerning the nature or absence of existence of the soul or spirit after death. The end times is the end of term. William Wildblood. Demographers estimate that 109 billion people have lived on the earth over the last 192,000 years, that being the date at which humans are seen as becoming properly human in the sense we now understand that designation. If you add to that figure the number of people alive today, you get a total of 117 billion humans, which means that 7% of people who ever lived are living now. It is thought that around 9 billion lived before the agricultural revolution in about 10,000 BC, and that at that time there were around 5 million humans in the world, but since the Industrial Revolution the number has climbed dramatically, with the global population hitting 1 billion around 1800 and then shooting up to where we are now. If you consider that up until relatively recently almost half the population died in childhood, our present situation seems even more remarkable. Obviously, the figures before recent times are highly speculative. But they are not based on nothing, and the numbers and general trends they indicate are probably accurate enough. My question is, does this mean anything from the spiritual point of view, from the evolution of souls point of view, or is it just a result of technological advances, medicine, agriculture, etc.? It certainly is a result of that, but is that all there is to it? I don't think so. In my book Earth as a School, I said that this world is a training ground for the soul. Part of the mechanism for this training is reincarnation, which, in the way I envisage it, involves an infant soul returning to a particular environment in order to develop its inchoate capacities, mental, moral, creative and so on. It is also required to make a choice in a world in which that choice can go either way, for the reality of God is not a given here as it would be in the spiritual worlds. Here there is just enough material data to support either the acceptance or rejection of God, so the inbuilt orientation of the soul, whether it is aligned to God or to self, is brought into play. Predominantly aligned, I mean, for both tendencies are always present in the soul as a result of free will. The need for this choice has always been present, but what is happening now is that everything is being brought to a head. This is why there is such a large population, and is yet another indication we are in that period known as the end times. Extending the school analogy, this is the time of graduation. No doubt some souls have already graduated, though I personally think that only a few have, but now is the final exam for many, with the choices becoming more marked. We live during a period when religion has lost its power, so the choice we make is necessarily more of an individual one. It even has to go against the flow, which makes it more personal, and a truer test of our inner self. Those that pass will progress to higher spiritual worlds, while those that don't make the grade will have to continue on lower levels of being, with, no doubt, fresh opportunities further down the line, but they will have missed an important cutoff point. Captivity in the Tower of Cirith Ungol is, from Frodo's perspective, the ultimate hopeless situation, yet he was wrong to despair. Bruce Charlton. Over at the Notion Club Papers, and using an example from The Lord of the Rings, I discuss how no situation is ever hopeless, and no situation ever justifies despair, for one who inhabits the divinely created world of a good God. And, on the other hand, it is despair itself that cuts us off from valid grounds for hope. When The Lord of the Rings begins, we see almost everything from Frodo's perspective, through Frodo's eyes. But after as Frodo and Sam leave the Fellowship, and their separate journey with the One Ring proceeds, the point of view shifts from Frodo to Sam. One consequence is that the situation of Frodo's paralysis by Shelob, the ring being taken from the apparently dead Frodo by Sam while he is only unconscious, and then Frodo's capture, imprisonment and torment in Cirith Ungol, are all seen from the perspective of Sam, who is trying to find and rescue Frodo. We therefore hear about Frodo's response to the apparent, utter hopelessness of his situation, only after he has already been rescued by Sam. And Frodo's desolation at the loss of the ring is described only for a few moments before Sam returns it to him.
"They've taken everything, Sam," said Frodo. "Everything I had. Do you understand? Everything." He cowered on the floor again with bowed head, as his own words brought home to him the fullness of the disaster, and despair overwhelmed him. "The quest has failed, Sam. Even if we get out of here, we can't escape. Only elves can escape. Away, away out of Middle-earth, far away over the sea. If even that is wide enough to keep the shadow out."
Frodo's despair at losing the ring is depicted while the reader is aware that the ring is not incipiently in Sauron's hands, but is in Sam's possession, in the room and right in front of Frodo. So, for us, Frodo's cry of desolation is tinged with irony, and we realize that this misery will be brief. We don't, therefore, appreciate the full impact of Frodo's earlier situation, as it was experienced by Frodo at the time. But if we imagine how matters seemed to Frodo, just a few minutes before this scene, it is apparent that here again is one of those situations in Lord of the Rings where there is apparently no hope at all. After all, Frodo is in Mordor, far from any possibility of help, in a fortress full of hundreds of orcs who all hate him, and are arguing whether to torture him immediately, or obey orders and send Frodo to the impregnable Dark Tower where he will encounter Sauron himself. Meanwhile, Frodo is sick from Shelob's venom, stripped and whipped and taunted incessantly, and worst of all he has the knowledge of having failed his friends and the world and lost the precious One Ring that has a terrible and addictive grip upon him. It is hard to imagine a more validly despair-inducing situation, a situation more genuinely hopeless. And yet that estimate of no hope turns out to be wrong, a factually incorrect assumption. Of course, the situation is fictional. But it is nonetheless true. By this point in the story, we are reading Lord of the Rings exactly because of its truth, because its characters and situations are real. So, the mistaken nature of Frodo's despair is a genuine life lesson for us, if we care to learn from it. The lesson that we ought never to despair, and never means never, no matter what. At the practical level, we should never give up hope because we never know all the relevant facts, and some of what we don't know may make all the difference. At the deepest level, we should never give up hope because we inhabit the divine creation of a good and loving God, and therefore we always can and will be helped ultimately. We will be helped, that is, as long as we have not given up hope. Because despair is a rejection of the reality of divine creative goodness, and despair is what cuts us off from divine providence. By despairing, we choose to believe that God cannot help us, or does not want to help us, and thereby we place ourselves beyond reach of God's help. As we see elsewhere, with the self-chosen fate of Denethor, we actively embraces despair, and from doing so embraces evil, and does the work of Sauron. Significantly, it was Denethor's vision of Frodo's captivity in the Palantir, true, yet incomplete as it was, that was what finally broke his spirit, and destroyed his last hope. The strategic psyop of global horror intended to overwhelm with fear and inculcate despair. Bruce Charlton. It strikes me that there has been and is a very long-term demonic psyop, which has largely succeeded in embroiling the world's discourse in a non-stop festival of horror, with the aim of overwhelming us with fear and inculcating an extremity of despair. There is, of course, more than enough horror in the world at any time, and then there is a vast amount of lying, selection and distortion. And nearly all of this reported as happening remotely, elsewhere and to other people, or indeed, supposedly, in the past, and we know it only by second/third/nth hand report by agents. We know it mostly, or wholly, via agents who serve the agenda of evil, and who supply slanted or inverted concepts with which we are intended to interpret their alleged facts. On top of this there is a dominant ethic, or value system, which both implies and argues that, because of the alleged extremity, pervasiveness and causes of this reported evil, remote evils are actually the most significant evil in the world. By comparison, whatever evils that we personally experience and know are portrayed as trivial and subjective. This combination of depictions of extreme reported horror, with a pervasive and powerfully enforced value system that puts this reported horror at the center of the ethical concern of people worthy of admiration and respect, makes for a potentially lethal cocktail. I say potentially lethal, because, like so many aspects of the modern world, this evil-made and evil-motivated situation within divine creation, is made use of and intended by God to teach us vital lessons during this actual mortal life here and now. It is nigh impossible to avoid exposure to this inducement to sin, and to be influenced by it. Yet, as Christians, we ought first to recognize that fear and despair are sins that must be acknowledged and repented. The upshot is that we are each compelled to deal with this very strong source of temptation to sin, so that we will not be manipulated into evil attitudes for the evil ends of our evil overlords. As usual in such situation, our single most vital defense is to acknowledge what is going on, that we have been deliberately placed and kept in a deliberately corrupting situation by the powers of purposive evil and their servants. But no matter how corrupting the situation, and how compromised we have become by past choices, our loving God, by His creative power, will always ensure that there is a way to learn and an open route to salvation. From that basic understanding, our experiences of being manipulated may lead to us learning many and important life lessons, of permanent benefit to us in the life everlasting to come, and to develop attitudes that lead us towards salvation, rather than towards the intended self-damnation consequent upon surrendering to fear and despair. Was there ever a golden age? Camelot and the Vision of Albion, by Jeffrey Ashe, 1971. Bruce Charlton. Jeffrey Ashe is one of my favorite authors, and Camelot and the Vision of Albion, 1971, is, for me, his best book. Strongly recommended. I have been rereading it, slowly and with much provoked thought, for the past couple of weeks, and pondering its core ideas, concerning the powerful conviction of a golden age, specifically for Britain, Albion, how this is exemplified by the Arthurian matter of Britain through its many developments. William Blake's writings, especially his long prophetic poem Jerusalem, are given especially close attention. More broadly, the book is about the idea of a golden era that is lost. Camelot remains as a visionary memory, yet may be recovered, including an heroic leader, such as Arthur, who has died, yet may return. Ashe considers how such visionary ideals have been recurrent through many places and times, how they have shaped, and continue to shape, the human imagination, and have inspired human action, individual and societal. The book is typical of the best of late 1960s, early 1970s psychological and social reflection, which is, at a higher general level than anything since, which means that the treatment of Christianity is largely comparative and in terms of its effects, rather than assuming some form of Christianity to be truth about reality, and exploring the consequences of that assumption. This despite that Ash was himself an active and devout Roman Catholic. He never states this in his major works, and I did not know about it until after his death. When it comes to the basic idea that there once was a golden age, and that we ought to be working restore its essence in the future, I assent only partly, only about 50%. Clearly an idea as frequent and near universal as the past golden age must be based in something real, and my assumption is that this is some combination of our memories of early childhood, with some kind of yearning for the simple hunter-gatherer life that used to be universal for men. But how golden are such lives? I think the point is that the human consciousness of the golden age is best understood as being much more natural and spontaneous and present-minded, and much less self-aware than adults and modern men. Therefore, the golden age cannot be restored when men have modern adult consciousness, and it cannot be restored in the context of any settled, civilized, organized society or civilization, because such lives require planning, specialization, organization, and many other things that alienate us and subjugate us. More deeply, there are the twin realities of evil and entropy. Firstly, what about evil and entropy, i.e. disease, degeneration and death, in the Golden Age? My understanding is that awareness of these was diminished by the lesser development of consciousness among children and early tribal people. Therefore, evil and entropy were always present, but not conceptualized, mostly ignored, easily forgotten. So, by my understanding, the Golden Age did not solve the perennial problems of mortal life on Earth, it just found these problems much easier than we do not to think about. This is why there can be no future Golden Age, because we now are aware of these problems, to the extent that many people's lives are made fearful and miserable by thinking about them, even when they are not actually being experienced. Those who believe in the possibility of a future Golden Age must therefore posit some qualitative change in men. The future golden men must, if that age is to be golden, not be motivated by evil, they must not be susceptible to disease and degeneration, they must not be troubled by death and loss. Which means that such men will not be like us, they will no be us, and it's no solution to the problems of entropy and evil in the human condition to posit a golden age for other people and somewhere else in which there is neither entropy nor evil, it's a non sequitur. If everything needs to be changed, then that is a replacement, not a solution. More deeply still, the ideal of a future golden age does not, and cannot say how, even in theory, evil could be eliminated, when it is found in all beings including ourselves, and how entropy could be eliminated when it seems universal. My conclusion is that the golden age for us, for ourselves, can lie only in another state and place of being, not in this world. For me, that would be heaven, and it lies out with this mortal world. In sum, the yearning for a restored golden age is understandable, significantly reality-based, and we can learn much from it, but ultimately it is impossible. Paucity of motivations among the New World Orderers. Bruce Charlton. In considering the dwindling to ineffectuality of positive national motivations, we soon find ourselves up against the recognition that there are extremely few motivations, and no public and organized ones, that don't seem to crumble in our hands. This applies even to the, by far, most dominant and successful motivator of recent generations, the plan to construct a new world order, a pan-global totalitarian system of omni-surveillance and micro-control. The stunning success of this motivator is rooted in its enabling tens of millions of implementers among national leadership classes such as managers, journalists, academics, administrators etc., to feel good about themselves, their opinions, their work. But this feeling positively good has swiftly crumbled away as the system became more powerful. Now the motivation of the NWO implementer class is almost wholly negative, to the point that they often deny the positive, once justifying, goal of their endeavors. They deny, especially in public, that they actually are working to build and extend a pan-global system of self-styled, benevolent rulership aiming at peace, prosperity, comfort, convenience for all. Nowadays, this same class is possessed by almost wholly negative motivations, relating to fear of, hatred for, and determination to eliminate, ever more and more people and classes. Their focus is to find and eliminate all of those who, supposedly, stand in the path of what are actually ever more nebulous and incoherent goals, such as social justice / equity / diversity / inclusion / sustainability / health, etc., etc. Consequently, the actuality is now pursuit of social justice through differentially targeted and asymmetrically applied laws / regulations, peace through provoking and escalating ever more, and more destructive, wars, prosperity through destroying economies / food production / trade and transport, comfort and convenience by promoting worldwide violent chaos. This is a consequence of replacing positive goals with double negatives across the board, creative destruction, as I have called it, in which destruction is upfront and actual and purposive, whereas any subsequent betterment is vague, conjectural, and almost never happens. Instead of working for some state of affairs, the NWOers are working against particular people and groups. And indeed, some of those worked against are imaginary and manufactured threats. I regard this long-term and, so far, inexorable devolution from positive to negative goals, as a very general trend of this era, both symptom and cause of the increasing evil affiliation of humanity. It is therefore something that needs to be recognized, in ourselves primarily, but also as a fact of life as we experience it. Negation cannot be a valid basis for living, so it behoves us, each and all, to find some genuinely positive motivation upon which we can base our motivations and build our lives. This is not being given us by anything external, not by society at large, not by any of the social institutions, including not by any of the churches. To find a genuinely positive motivation, we must either derive it from our individual spiritual insight and intuition, and/or actively seek it among the great mass of evil-affiliated dross and poison of corrupt institutions. It is up to us. The overcoming of darkness and death is the grand theme. Bruce Charlton.
The reality or otherwise of a greater life can be seriously discussed. If we consider the saints and martyrs and patriots, the artists and mystics and revolutionaries who have believed in it, if we study the movements embodying that belief, do we find that the humanist science which denies it can explain all the facts, psychological, historical and poetic? And should it fail to do so, what are the implications of the residual mysteries? If humanist science succeeds and there are no mysteries, then the sooner such illusions are shed, the better. But their dismissal will leave the humanist facing his old problem: how the mortal worms of men in their billions can be brought to accept mortality, and care about an infinite vista of progress when their own lives are finite and unprogressive. In any case, the overcoming of darkness and death is the grand theme. Edited from the closing paragraphs of Camelot and the Vision of Albion, by Jeffrey Ashe.
For darkness and death I read evil and entropy, which are, indeed, the grand theme of this mortal life, a theme that can be ignored only at the cost of regarding ourselves as mortal worms, as futile and temporary patterns of unalive atoms. But does this matter? Why can't men continue to live, as they now do, mostly and increasingly, from hour to hour, day by day, responding, as compelled or inclined, to immediate incentives, to live just as mortal worms, and to be content with this? Well, men can and do continue to live thus, but there are consequences, and men are not, apparently, content. Because the consequences of such a worldview do and shall depend on what kind of world this actually is. Not merely what we want or assume it to be, but what it actually is. The view of humanist science, of mainstream materialist metaphysics, is that this just is a universe without purpose. In such a universe the mortal worms will, ultimately, be left alone to drift through their present moments of mechanical stimuli and responses, until they die, and this ceases. Such a view is not rooted in evidence or experience, it is rooted in assumptions concerning what is objectively real, i.e. only material things, detectable, measurable, modeled by science, all else being regarded as unreal, subjective, mental constructs merely. But if this material reality contains more than the assumptions of humanist science have predecided to include in its worldview, and if those unrecognized realities, residual mysteries, include beings of purposive evil, then the mortal worms will not be left alone, but their brief lives will be manipulated, and will be channeled towards the purposes of darkness. In other words, modern materialism has predecided to assume that there is no objective purpose in reality. Predecided that the only valid explanations are strictly meaningless, of undirected randomness and mechanical cause and response. But if there is an objective purpose, and if that purpose includes evil purpose, and when that actually existing evil purpose is denied, hence unacknowledged by the mass of mortal worms, well, this fact will make a decisive difference to the experiences during the brief lives of these mortal worms. If so, what then? The choice is between continuing to exclude and ignore the reality of darkness, and uncomplainingly, because complaint is futile, and increases misery, accept whatever happens to us in the short period between birth and extinction. Or, on the other hand, we must accept that the grand theme is to overcome death and darkness, which points beyond the experiences of this mortal world of evil and entropy. Or more exactly than this negative talk of overcoming bad things, we would need positively to pursue a goodness and immortality. Sooner or later recognizing that, in our actual continuous experience, goodness and immortality, while we know them from direct inner conviction, only fully exist in some realm other than the present dispensation of ourselves and our environment. Should there be a seventh simple machine, the spring? Bruce Charlton. My son suggests that there ought to be a seventh simple machine added to the usual 6, which is the spring. The standard 6 are: 1. Lever. 2. Inclined plane. 3. Wedge. 4. Wheel and axle. 5. Pulley. 6. Screw. These are distinguished on the basis of their basic function, each does something distinct in mechanical terms. We could perhaps add spring for 2 reasons. Firstly, because a spring does something, i.e. stores energy, that the other machines don't, and secondly because a spring is, or can be, simple. Therefore it could be argued that a spring is also a simple machine. Makes sense to me, albeit I suppose a spring isn't actually doing anything in terms of mechanisms, rather enabling something to be done in future. More exactly, a spring does not fit the definition of a machine, in terms of a machine being something that changes the direction or magnitude of a force. On the other hand, by a common-sense understanding of what constitutes a machine, the spring does seem to be an appropriate addition. As nearly always, answers depend on assumptions, on prior definitions and exclusions. By the way, such simple machines can be used, with intelligence and planning, and some joinery ability, to accomplish the apparently impossible. Such as quickly, within minutes, moving a 439-pound box containing fragile precision machinery, from the back of a van down steps into a basement, equipped only with the strength of a single 13-year-old boy. The Cassandra Syndrome. William Wildblood. I don't know how many readers have experienced this phenomenon, but I find these days if I speak to anyone, even in watered-down tones, about the parlous state of the world, the country, the culture and the human soul. Eyes roll and I'm told I'm talking nonsense. I have only one acquaintance in the real world who would go along with any of that. Most people simply cannot accept that the Western world in the 21st century stands on the edge of a precipice. Perhaps I just don't know the right people. Cassandra, as I am sure you know, was a Trojan princess who was cursed by the god Apollo because she turned him down after he had given her the gift of prophecy in exchange for sexual favors. Her fate thereafter was that everything she prophesied would be true, but no one would believe her. This has echoes of Mark 6:4, when Jesus said that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and among his own kin and in his own house. I am no prophet, but the spiritual state of the world is so bad that anyone who has the slightest awareness of reality ought to be able to see it. The remarkable thing is most don't, and I am tempted to say they won't either. They refuse to do so because they are too firmly ensconced in their own comfortable pseudo-reality. They will go along with the clearly biased and fictitious mainstream narrative as we saw in the events of 2020 and again more recently, and get quite angry if holes in this are presented to them. They will talk about science when it appears to back them up, but utterly reject it when it does not. Why is this? One reason is that most people are still cushioned by comfort and relative wealth. They don't want their boat to be rocked. As long as the trains run on time, so to speak, they will believe everything is fine, not realizing that when an electric fan is turned off, the blades continue to revolve for a while, but more and more slowly until they stop. The time to be concerned is when the current is cut, not when the blades stop, by which time it may be too late. Then we live in a culture which has become heavily feminized, and such a culture no longer has truth as a priority. It is replaced by a relativistic attitude in which there is no higher or lower, but everybody has to be accepted on their own terms because we're all equal. That way we all get along, supposedly. In such a nursery world, truth can seem hard and ugly, threatening even, and so you ignore it, but truth is what is, and what is cannot be denied. If you do, you will only bring greater suffering on yourself in the long term. The Trojans ignored Cassandra when she warned them about the horse left behind by the Greeks. They brought it inside their gates and its foreign occupants destroyed them, a parallel which should give us pause for thought today. And then most people now have zero awareness of the spiritual reality of things. Religion has been destroyed in the UK, and the tried and tested traditional wisdom of the past has been sidelined for fashionable dogma. The takeover of the country's institutions, political, legal, educational, the media, by the forces of atheism and materialism is now complete. Some commentators speculate that these institutions have been the victims of deliberate sabotage as a result of communist infiltration, and the process has been so insidious and so comprehensive that does to be seen the only reasonable explanation. However, even if this is what has happened, we need to recognize that the agents carrying out the scheme in this world are the servants, not the masters, which doesn't make them any better, but we should know the ultimate source of the evil, and that is supernatural. How have they got away with this? One answer is suggested by Yeats in his prophetic poem The Second Coming, when he sums up the situation in a couple of lines that have become well known. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Evil hates good, and that gives it its passionate intensity, but most people's connection to the good is too feeble to make them fight for it, and this is doubly so when they have been indoctrinated to believe that fighting is morally wrong in itself, because to fight is to hate. And so we are left with the strange situation in which actual hatred disguises itself as love and condemns supposed hatred, in reality love of the good, in order to delegitimize any opposition to itself. But we have to fight for truth when it is under assault. Given the climate in which we currently live, I should stress I mean fight with words, and that even words must be chosen with care. Having said that, listen to what Jesus has to say in John 8:44 about the Pharisees, of whom there are still a great many around today.
You are from your father the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies.
Isn't this hate speech, to use a modern term? Maybe, but it comes from the apostle of love, which should make us think. The fact is, there is evil. It has a spiritual source and it has to be recognized for what it is and fought with all our strength. The Trojans refused to listen to Cassandra because she disturbed them. They would rather close their minds to truth than accept reality because reality challenged their comfortable illusions. Most prophets bring bad news, that, after all, is their function, to call an erring community back to God or the gods. But Cassandra was right, and if the Trojans had listened to her, they might have avoided their utter destruction. The progression of Luciferic, Harmonic and Sorothic evil, related to our loving Creator personal God, and to Jesus Christ. Bruce Charlton. Christianity is not just about Jesus Christ, it is built upon several other realities. 1. We inhabit a creation, the world is created. 2. The Creator is a God, i.e. a personal God, not an abstraction. 3. The Creator God is loving towards all the beings of creation. God might be otherwise, but is not. In sum, Jesus operates in the context of reality being the creation of a loving, hence necessarily personal, God. Jesus is necessary because of the nature of creation. Creation takes place in the midst of primordial chaos. Primordial chaos is primal beings existing without love, without coordination, without harmony, each being a world unto himself. This is why our mortal reality, termed primary creation, is subject to entropy. Entropy is the spontaneous tendency of creation to revert to primordial chaos. We experience entropy in terms of disease, degenerative change, and the inevitability of death for all beings. Jesus offers the possibility of permanent and complete escape from entropy and the threat of chaos. Evil is the rejection of creation. Evil therefore came after creation. Evil entails the rejection of love, since love between beings is what makes creation. Creation is the harmony of beings. The first evil is called Luciferic. Luciferic evil is the assertion of a being's selfishness, myself is all that matters, and the rejection of love between oneself and other beings. Luciferic evil therefore aspires to use, therefore not destroy, creation, to use creation in order to serve its own selfish will and personal gratification. Luciferic evil does not aspire to the damnation of other beings, i.e. to make them reject resurrection into heaven. It tends to be indifferent to the spiritual fate of other beings. A luciferically evil being exploits ruthlessly and without love, desires that any and all other beings will serve his personal satisfaction. In a sense, a luciferic being desires that creation will serve his will. This is why he is not against creation as such. It could be said that luciferic evil hates God, is anti-God, because God is loving, and is indifferent to Jesus. The second evil is harmonic. Luciferic evil tends to develop into harmonic evil, because luciferically evil beings band together in mutually beneficial alliances, in order more effectively to exploit other beings. Harmonic evil is an alliance of the selfish. Harmonic evil is anti-God, which it inherits from luciferic evil, and harmonic evil is in addition anti-Jesus. Thus luciferic equals anti-God, whereas harmonic equals anti-God plus anti-Jesus. Therefore the alliance of the selfish will organize, manipulate and coerce other beings, aiming that these other beings will reject salvation, will reject the offer of resurrection to eternal life in heaven. In sum, while luciferic evil desires the exploitation of beings, Harmonic evil desires the damnation of beings. Harmonic evil desires damnation because it is more spitefully evil than luciferic evil. Its desires are not just for selfish gratification, but also for the immiseration of others. It could reasonably be said, therefore, that harmonic evil is a greater evil than luciferic, wanting not just its own satisfaction, but the stripping of satisfaction from others. This is why harmonic evil has tended towards depersonalization via bureaucracy. The harmonic aim of omni-surveillance and micro-control is not just a positive aspiration for domination, it is also actively directed against the freedom and agency of other beings. Yet harmonic evil of itself does not aim at the destruction of other beings, it aims at domination, not destruction. It wants a universe of miserable slaves. Indeed, including the enslavement of animals, plants, earth and heavenly bodies, and indeed the mineral world, permanent utter domination of everything, rather than to kill everything. And the harmonic desire for damnation of other beings is a consequence of being against freedom and agency. Salvation is, after all, an eternal choice for resurrected men to participate in divine creation, which absolutely entails their agency and freedom. The third evil is sorothic. Sorothic evil is anti-creation, it aspires ultimately to reduce creation to chaos. Sorothic evil is directed against all kinds of creation, it is against not only positive good, but also against luciferic and harmonic evils, insofar as these seek to exploit or enslave creation. Sorothic evil can be considered a completion of the motivational shift from luciferic to harmonic evil, which is a shift from seeking personal gratification by using other beings, to a type of personal gratification that enjoys the utter domination of other beings. A qualitative shift from hedonism to spitefulness. Sorothic evil moves on from the desire to dominate the whole of creation, to the desire to destroy all of creation, including oneself, insofar as we all are products of divine creation. The sorothic can be seen as a purely negative form of evil, found in beings that have lost all capacity for positive personal satisfaction, and can only enjoy destruction. To summarize, luciferic evil is pro-creation and anti-God because anti-love. Harmonic evil is pro-creation and anti-God, anti-love, and also Jesus, anti-salvation. While sorothic evil is anti-all manifestations of creation, including anti-all beings, including anti-God and anti-Jesus Christ, also anti-love, and anti-salvation. Sorothic evil tends to chaos, but it is not pro-chaos. Ultimately, sorothic chaos is the negation of creation, the end result of being anti-everything. Note on sin equals entropy and evil, salvation being from both entropy and evil. Entropy, termed death, and evil are, together, what is called sin in the fourth gospel. Jesus came to save us from sin, that is, to offer us the chance to reject sin eternally, live without sin eternally. Thus resurrection into eternal heavenly life saves us both from entropy including death, as well as disease and degenerative change, and simultaneously saves us from evil of all kinds. Resurrected eternal life in heaven in therefore the second creation, which is derived from primary creation but operating entirely and eternally on the basis of love, and without entropy or evil, because sin is left behind at resurrection. Why bother with the sorothic understanding of evil? Bruce Charlton. It might be asked why it is potentially useful to have a differentiated understanding of evil. Why, in particular, it is helpful to be clearer about sorothic evil. I think it is helpful to anybody, of almost any religion, to be aware that some evils of this world, including, I believe, the dominant motivation for current wars by Western powers against the Fire Nation, in and around Arrakis and potentially the largest polity of the Far East, are actually negatively motivated. These are Sorothic wars plus. These are wars that are ultimately, covertly, behind the self-enriching bribes, and geopolitical excuses, being provoked, sustained, escalated for reasons of destruction rather than for anything that might be gained from them. In other words, such wars continue, and continue to grow, long beyond the point when those in charge might be expected to benefit from them. The Sorothic insight is also potentially helpful from a Christian perspective, because Sorothic evil is not primarily directed against the salvation of men. This can be confusing to Christians, who tend to assume that all real evil is directed towards the damnation of souls. This took me until yesterday to get clear. If evil is assumed to be directed against Christian hopes primarily, it becomes hard to see why destruction should become a dominant goal. Indeed, it might turn out that Sorothic wars are less bad for Christianity than is the current global bureaucratic totalitarian system of value inversions, because harmonic totalitarian evil is indeed anti-salvation, primarily. It is an interesting aspect of the ongoing wars that they are destructive of all kinds of people. Yes, the Fire Nation is Christian, but their more slaughtered opponents are Western ideologues and secular nationalists. The Iraqis conflict is between non-Christians, and numerous secular Choam. But all this makes sense when it is recognized that Sorothic evil is directed against divine creation, against anything and everything created, rather than being orientated specifically against Christian salvation. Many people have the attitude, but what is the use of understanding evil, if we can do nothing practical about it? Especially given that destruction is so much easier than creation. It may be very difficult to win a war, but it is much easier to make a war more destructive. And that is exactly what we are seeing. So, what is the use of understanding, even if it is true? There are at least two answers, assuming an understanding is indeed true. First is that we cannot do anything practical and effective, until after we first understand truly. But second is that any true understanding is valuable in itself, in terms of the spiritual war of this mortal world. True understanding is valuable for the first understander in his discerning quest to learn from experience in this mortal life. And that truth is also potentially valuable for those who may subsequently choose to share that spiritual possibility, by direct knowing. Because all true learning is permanent and potentially accessible to all those who seek truth. I say religion because, although different religions explain evil in various ways, without religion there can be no coherent understanding of evil. While there have been Sorothic individuals in history, there has never been a Sorothic culture or civilization until the modern West. Thus, in the past, the Sorothic phase of a war tended to be a brief and terminal episode, and the leader became consumed by a destructive frenzy that is rapidly self-destroying, like, apparently, the last days in the bunker, or the fictive example of Saruman. But at a societal level, this entfozo of Sorothic evil can be, and is being, much more prolonged. Prolonged partly because multiple people are involved, with overlapping influence, and partly because the people in charge are under supernatural demonic influence/control, such that individual human leaders are disposable and may die, yet the strategy continues. Voluntarily to participate in voting, is to invite evil into one's heart. Bruce Charlton. Voting, as a method for arriving at binding decisions, is clearly evil in itself and tends to corrupt participating individuals, as becomes obvious to those, but there are few such, who shake off the propaganda, and ask the right questions. Furthermore, the extent to which voting corrupts its participants has increased, as the range of options to be voted upon have all become evil-aligned, yet evil in their nature. In other words, voting is more extremely evil when the voter is choosing between evils, and is casting his lot for, what he tries to discern as, the lesser of acknowledged evils. Lesser or not, a vote for evil is a vote for evil. In different words, voting is not so bad when a vote can be, and is, cast for some positive net good, for example for some good affiliated person, party, policy. But voting becomes extremely corrupting when all possible options are net evil, evil affiliated. When all choices are actually motivated against God, divine creation, Jesus Christ. Then all voters are actually voting for evil. Evil, because the process and act of voluntary voting is, passively expressed an act of consent, also, actively conceptualized, itself an action in support. When evil is voted for, including a lesser evil, then this is to invite evil into one's heart. And that is the only way that evil can enter one's heart. We cannot be made evil purely from external influence, evil must, like a vampire, be invited within. And surely the actual corruption from voting is obvious to anyone who is good affiliated and stands out with the processes of voting. Such as political elections, but also any other situation when would-be binding in advance decisions are made by some mathematical counting procedure. How could anyone regard such a procedure as intrinsically virtuous? Ultimately, voting has come to dominate societies of the modern world. At every level power is exercised, exactly because when people voluntarily participate mentally in the business of voting, they are choosing to take the side of evil in the spiritual war of this world. And the spiritual war is what matters most to those with greatest power. By voting, men are choosing to corrupt themselves, by inviting evil into their hearts, again and again. By defending voting, they are doubling down on evil, actively repelling good. Furthermore, as the matters voted upon have been made all evil, and more evil, such corruption has accelerated and become more extreme.